Hello friends, this is the first passage of the set A of the CSAT question paper of 2014. So I'm going to go through the passage and you can see what all things I am focusing on. So in recent times, India has grown fast, not only compared to its own past, but also in comparison with other nations. So two things to be noticed here, that India has grown fast compared to itself over time and also with other nations. But there cannot be any room for complacency. So whenever you're reading a passage, please pay attention to these kind of words. But, also, however, these kind of words give you a change in direction. So here you can see that the author is applauding the growth of India, but it is saying that he's making another point that there is no room for complacency. Complacency means being assured and saying, okay, we have done very well in life and we don't want to do anything extra. Because why is he saying there is no room for complacency? Because it is possible for Indian economy to develop even faster. So he's saying there is even more scope and also to spread benefits of this growth more widely than has been done before. So again, you need to keep thinking in your mind. So here you're saying that there is more scope and also you're saying that there is lack of inclusive growth. See, you're all preparing for this exam, so you would have prepared for the general studies paper also. So please apply that knowledge in your reading comprehension also. Okay, so before going into details of the kind of microstructural changes that we need to conceptualize and then proceed to implement, it is worthwhile to elaborate on the idea of inclusive growth. Again, he talks about inclusive growth that constitutes the defining concept behind this government's various economic policies and decisions. So in this, sometimes you may not understand each and every line. So here you may not understand what microstructural changes he is talking about, so just don't bother about it, read further. It might become clearer as you go along. Okay, a nation interested in inclusive growth views the same growth differently depending on whether the gains of the growth are heaped primarily on a small segment or shared widely by the population. The latter is cause for celebration but not the former. So as you can see, again and again the author is talking about inclusive growth. So he's saying, in other words, growth must not be treated as an end in itself, but as an instrument for spreading prosperity to all. Again, this is something which is important. You must notice this particular thing. So, because he's saying growth is not an end in itself. So, by now you would have gotten a sense that growth is not very, very important for the author if it is not accompanied by spreading the gains equitably. India's own past experience and the experience of other nations suggest that growth is necessary for eradicating poverty, but it is not a sufficient condition. So here you should have made a mental note that growth is necessary but not sufficient. Okay, but he's definitely not saying that growth is not required. So here you should have taken that as a mental note. Okay. Then we say, complemented with policies to ensure that more and more people join in the growth process, and further there are mechanisms in place to redistribute some of the gains to those who are unable to partake in the market process and hence get left behind. Again, you are saying that the policies should ensure growth but complemented with policies that make sure that people who are getting left behind can partake in the growth process. So they join in the growth process. Okay, till now he was talking about the general concept of inclusive growth. Now here you need to pay more attention. He's saying a simple way of giving this idea of inclusive growth a sharper form is to measure a nation's progress in terms of the progress of its poorest segment. For instance, the bottom 20% of the population. So now you can see that till now he was talking about something that we all knew, that inclusive growth is important. Now he is saying, how do you do this? How do you find out whether we are growing inclusively or not? So he is saying you need to measure the nation's progress in terms of the progress of its poorest segment. So we can measure a nation's progress in many ways. As you know, there is something called GDP. You all know. There is something called GDP per capita, right? So these are various concepts. So you know that these are there. Now what is the author suggesting? That you measure the nation's progress only in terms of the progress of the bottom 20% of the population. Okay. Now he says one could measure the per capita income of the bottom quintile of the population and also calculate the growth rate of income and evaluate our economic success in terms of these measures that pertain to the poorest segment. So till now, even if you are not an economic student, you do not understand this much, but you can understand that the author is saying that you look at only the growth rate, right? Or you look at the per capita income of only the poorest segment. Okay, this much you can understand. So this is very important. It may or may not turn out to be important in the questions, but this is important as far as the passage is concerned. This approach is attractive because it does not ignore the growth like some of the other heterodox criteria did. Again, you don't understand what heterodox is, you don't understand what he's talking about, fine. But you know that it is not ignoring the growth of the poorest population. It simply looks at the growth of the income of the poorest section of the population. It also ensures that those who are outside of the bottom quintile do not get ignored. Now, what is the obvious criticism of this choice, of this approach? If I am just measuring the growth rate of the poorest people, that then somebody would say that, what about the people who are, just above this level? So let us say we find out that, let us say people, weavers, let us just take a hypothetical example that the weavers are in the bottom 20%. Now what about the people who are not weavers, let us say who are carpenters, who are in the bottom 30, between 30 and 20. So he says, so he is addressing that criticism. It ensures that those who are outside the bottom quintile do not get ignored. If that were done, then those people would in all likelihood drop down to the bottom quintile and so would automatically become a direct target of our policies. So he's saying that, okay, let us say we focus only on the bottom 20, that is weavers. Now those people will move up and let us say the carpenters fall down. So but again we will be measuring the income of the carpenters. So in that case, now we will be targeting our policies towards them and hence they would improve. Hence the criterion being suggested here is a statistical summing up of the idea of inclusive growth. So he's saying we are giving a mathematical measure of inclusive growth, which in turn leads to two corollaries. To wish that India must strive to achieve high growth and that we must work to ensure that the weakest segment benefit from the growth. Here he is summarizing that we will get two things by doing this: high growth and also weakest segment benefiting from the growth. So this is the first thing and this is the second. So I just read the whole passage to you to give you an idea how I would have approached the passage had it come in my exam. So this is how I would have read it quickly, obviously, and making very quick mental notes as to what is the author trying to say. Now before moving to the questions, let's use some of the techniques that we learned in the technique videos. So we learned that for any passage we need to think about the topic, then we need to think about the scope, and then the purpose. Okay, so the topic of this passage, as you would undoubtedly agree, is India's growth or India's development or India's growth and development, something like that. The scope of the passage would be inclusive growth or how to achieve inclusive growth. All along we were talking about inclusive growth. Now what is the purpose of the author? Why did he sit down to write this whole passage? The purpose of the author is to propagate a measure for measuring inclusive growth, which he says is to measure the income of the bottom quintile. Okay, so this we have in our mind. You may or may not do this depending on the questions that are asked, but let us say we have done this. Now let us go to question number 1. The author's central focus. As you would understand, he is talking about the central focus or the purpose. Now applauding India's economic growth, not only, see, whenever you are asked a central focus, it will be one of these three. If the purpose, whatever you have thought as the purpose, if that is given, then that will be the answer. If that is not given, then the scope. If the scope is given, then the scope is the answer. If that is also not given, then the topic is the answer. Nothing apart from these three can be the answer to the central focus or main idea or purpose, those kind of questions. So given that, applauding India's economic growth not only against its own past performance but against other nations, definitely not correct, because it falls in neither of these three. This is a statement in the passage, but that is irrelevant. Emphasizing the need for economic growth, which is the sole determinant of a country's prosperity. Now this statement itself is also wrong, and so obviously it is not the answer choice. As you can see, this statement itself was correct, but it is not the answer to this particular question. Now let's go to the D choice first. Emphasizing high growth. Now that is again not the correct answer choice. Now read this: emphasizing inclusive growth where gains of growth are shared widely by the population. This is sort of between the scope and purpose that we define, but it is almost the scope of the passage. So this is the central focus. Had there been another choice, which let us say this was also there, and another choice would have been to propagate or to give a measure for inclusive growth which can help in tracking inclusive growth or something, then the central focus would have been that. Okay. The author supports policies which will help develop economic growth. Obviously, he does say that you need economic growth, but we need to see the other choices. Better distribution of incomes irrespective of rate of growth. This is completely wrong. Like I said, when we were reading the passage, he said that economic growth is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. So obviously this is not true. This is not true at all. The statement is true, but let us see if we can get a better choice. Develop economic growth and redistribute economic gains to those getting left behind. This seems like a very, very correct choice. So let me put a tick here. Put an emphasis on the development of the poorest segments of society. Now, if you see there in the passage, he does put an emphasis on the development of poorer segments of society, but you need to see this here. In other words, policies for promoting growth need to be complemented with policies to ensure that more and more people join in the growth process, and there are mechanisms in place to redistribute some of the gains to those who are unable to partake in the market process and hence getting left behind. So although this is very close, but this definitely seems like a better choice because it encompasses both the things, that he's talking about growth as well as redistribution. So this is a better choice. Okay, now then, question number 3. Consider the following statements. According to the author, India's economy has grown, but there is no room for complacency. As growth eradicates poverty, growth has resulted in prosperity for all. Now, this statement is true in the context of the passage, but this is not why he says that there is no room for complacency. When I was talking in the passage, I explained this. Again, growth has resulted in prosperity for all anyways is incorrect. The statement itself is incorrect. Now, if you read the first paragraph, you will find that the author says that there is no room for complacency for 2 reasons. One is that there is more scope, right? Still scope, we can grow even faster. And second, he said was that it is still not inclusive. So, these are not the reasons for the complacency bit. So whenever you have a particular question, go back to the passage and see that okay, complacency was talked about in this particular paragraph, and you will be able to find the right answer.